From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. U.S. President Joe Biden is delivering his State of the Union address on Tuesday. After 2 years in office, the United States is leading is arguably even more politically divided and economically challenged. Meanwhile, gun violence is still not under control and reports of police brutality, keeps surfacing. How will Biden address both the short-term and long-term challenges? What message will he be conveying to the American public? For more insights, I'm joined today in Beijing by Rick Dunham, a former White House correspondent of Business Week. He's currently leading the Global Business Journalism program at Tsinghua University. We also have with us Josef Mahoney, professor of politics at East China Normal University in Shanghai. And in Maryland, we have Sourabh Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist at the Institute for China-America Studies. Welcome, gentlemen. Let's get right to it. The State of the Union address to be delivered by President Joe Biden. Sourabh, why don't I go to you first? You are in Maryland. That is about 30 to 40 minutes drive from the Capitol Hill. Give us a sense of the atmosphere right now in the Beltway.
The atmosphere in the Beltway is politically charged. It has been politically charged for quite a while. It'll stay that way, especially with the Republicans having won the House. They are out there to try to torpedo Mr. Biden politically and from a policy perspective. And so it's going to be a very combustive year or combustive 2 years in American politics, because I would say, frankly, we are already in the early stages of the 2024 reelection process, frankly.
Yeah, Rick, you covered the White House for quite a while. It's not unusual for Washington to see a hung parliament where we have a divided Congress. What's your expectations for this State of Union address to be delivered by Joe Biden?
Well, I think he will try to reach out to Republicans on as many issues as he can, but most of it will be patting himself on the back. We'll be talking about the accomplishments of the administration, the lowering of inflation, the lowest rate of unemployment in the United States in 60 years. So I think he'll try to emphasize the positive and where he can work with Republicans, but there's always theatrics. I mean, there always are times when Democrats will applaud, standing ovation, Republicans won't do anything, and Republicans try to embarrass the president of Democratic
And occasionally
Party.
tearing down the whole speech, yeah. Behind the president.
Right, exactly.
McCarthy
exactly.
said he's not going to do that this time around.
No, I don't think so. I think he will try to look as presidential as possible. I mean, he will because it took him 15 ballots to win, and I think right now Kevin McCarthy just wants to build up his image as a statesman, but also as a leader of conservatives and a leader of Republicans. So I think he will try to do it in a more diplomatic way, but he's a partisan, and he owes his speakership to some of the very conservative members of the House. So he doesn't really have a lot of maneuvering room. He has to be pretty partisan.
Right. Joseph, what are you looking for from this State of the Union address?
I agree. He'll want to talk about low unemployment rates, but not why the U.S. has them or how they're driving up interest rates. I don't think he can really. I'm sure he will try to brag about interest rates coming down there, or inflation coming down. But in fact, the White House doesn't have much control over that, or at least they haven't actually done much. That's largely due to Fed operations, which are completely separate. I think he'll want to talk about his proxy war in Ukraine, as well as his aggressions towards China. I think he'll continue to hype this ridiculous balloon brouhaha, which unfortunately many Americans don't mind in principle. But my sense is that they're also tiring of too much focus on these international misadventures that are hurting their pocketbooks. Now, I think he'll predictably focus on gun control in wake of the recent violence. I think he'll talk about violence against minorities, including police brutality. He'll probably mention the Nichols case, the Tyree Nichols case out of Memphis. And certainly he will, I agree, extend an olive branch to McCarthy, who will be sitting behind him and who will try to appear diplomatic, but who will really be thinking about when he should frown or frown or avoid clapping.
Yeah, talking about the partisanship in the U.S. Congress, Sura, Joseph just mentioned the potential whereby Joe Biden may be courting, some bipartisan cooperation with McCarthy. After all, he's the new House Speaker. What kind of cooperation do you envision down the road? Build Back Better comes to mind, of course.
One area where the two have to cooperate, and in some ways fated to cooperate, even though there might be delays, is actually on the debt ceiling. McCarthy holds the whip hand out there, but at the end of the day, the two sides have to have a meeting of minds. Otherwise, we are going to have a default. And both sides understand the consequences, but there will be a lot of politicking with regard to that. And we'll see if there's a more detailed spending plan or spending cuts plan that comes out following that. The one area I think there is scope for cooperation in spite of the fact that everything is so fractious in the US Congress and so politicized, is in the area of big tech. Surprisingly, there are, from both sides of the aisle, a commonality of views on certain points in terms of privacy protections. To some extent, with regard to intermediary liabilities, something called Section 230 of the Communications Act. In terms of certain protections with regard to antitrust, there are differences. It's a very complex process. It'll be a compendium of many many provisions, but the two sides have a kind of a coming together of views. And if the two sides are willing, there is a scope for Biden and the Republicans to have a victory in terms of placing some curbs on big tech. But apart from these two areas, I really don't see where it's going to happen. Mr. Biden has been successful on the infrastructure front, on the green stimulus front, in terms of climate change related issues, and on the chips front, and he did that in a bipartisan way. That will not. On infrastructure, on Build Back Better, there is no consensus. There is no bipartisan consensus going forward. But on, as I said, debt ceiling, on restrictions, on big tech, I think there is potential for some very specific areas of cooperation.
All right, Rick, how do you see the potential of division versus unity, cooperation versus division, coming from Joe Biden's State of the Union and shortly afterwards in the next months and potentially years?
Well, I think foreign policy is an area where he can reach out to Republicans. I mean, the Russian invasion and the continuing aggression in Ukraine is one where overwhelmingly the American people favor the position of both President Biden and the Republicans in Congress to supply weaponry to resist the Russian takeover of eastern and southern Ukraine and Crimea. Also, although it could lead to tension, China is one of those issues. Republicans are saying Joe Biden is not doing enough to counter China's economic growth, and I think he may try to reach out to Republicans on China to try to make it bipartisan rather than what the Republicans want, which is to portray Biden as weak. I also do think that the idea of looking at government spending is one of those areas where Biden could reach out. And so I think those are three areas. Now, the tension is going to be over investigations of Biden. I mean, that's one where there's going to be growing partisanship over time. And Republicans are also going to be pushing on deregulation and pushing on what they see as the liberal bias of social media companies. So I think that you may see some tension on that over the next year.
Yeah, Rick, you talk about China and a potential bipartisanship against China. But we all know that a U.S. president has substantial power in terms of foreign policy making. Other than perhaps courting the Republicans at both chambers of Congress for horse trading, for passing his domestic agendas, what other constraints do you foresee when it comes to Biden's interactions with the members of Congress when it comes to China?
Yeah, I mean, he really. You're correct. That's one area where the president does have a pretty wide latitude. But in terms of legislation, in terms of particularly some of the restrictions on high-tech companies. I mean, the Republicans in the House have created a committee basically to investigate China for the next 2 years. And this is one where I think, Joe Biden is not nearly as hawkish as the Republicans are when it comes to China, and I think he may try to bring them in a way that could leave room for constructive engagement with China as well. I don't think the Republicans are particularly interested in economic engagement with China. I think that they want to be pretty hard line, and Joe Biden's trying to walk a fine line because of this criticism, and so I think he may try to reach out to tone down some of the harshest rhetoric of the Republicans.
Joseph, do you have anything to add? What are your thoughts on Joe Biden's potential interaction with the members of the Congress when it comes to policies vis-a-vis China?
Yeah, I'm not so optimistic that Biden is less hawkish. What Biden has advanced in terms of concrete containment efforts since he took office 2 years ago against China far outpace anything that we saw under Trump. And so I think Biden is begging for the sort of competition with Republicans of who can be stronger against China. And so I would be more concerned that whatever we see coming out of the House, that this will either be this opportunity for them to cooperate, or Biden will one-up them and propose something even more provocative in order to continue this political struggle that we see between both parties of who can be the toughest against China, especially as we head into the next presidential election.
Yeah, I mean, China has a policy of non-interference in other countries' domestic politics. I'm wondering if you think it's premature to predict if Joe Biden will be, it will be a foregone conclusion for Joe Biden to become the Democratic nominee for the race for 2024, as we see a very crowded race on the Republican side for the race in 2024. Joseph?
Yeah, I don't think that Biden will lose the nomination. I think that the main question at this point is who can defeat him on the Republican side. And in this case, the front runner to get the nomination is likely DeSantis out of Florida. The question is whether or not Trump will play the spoiler. I don't think Trump can win the nomination, but he can split the Republican vote enough that the Republicans would lose whatever potential margin in a very polarized national electorate.
Yeah,
so we may see
Right. Sourabh, you've been observing U.S.-China relations. You've been studying it. Your observations for U.S.-China relations, and especially Washington's posture vis-a-vis China in the next 2 years.
I actually think in this year, in 2023, there is the opportunity, the potential, the opportunity, whether it will be seized, I am not sure, of lending a certain degree of stability to the relationship. And that's why we've seen the relationship the leaders trying to stabilize the relationship, at least from the White House's perspective. I'm talking from the executive branch's perspective. Congress is going to be the spoiler out here, because I think Congress is going to go out of its way to spoil the relationship, frankly. And therefore, it's just going to be very messy in terms of congressional executive politics with regard to China this year, which was not so much the case previously, because what the Republicans are trying to do is, of course, denigrate China, but use that as a stick to beat Biden going into 2024. And that's why I think the House, that Select Committee on China, is going to devolve into a highly partisan exercise. And therefore, I think U.S.-China relations, I don't think they'll be terrible, because the executive branch is going to try to play a steady hand out there, but it's not going to have much opportunity to be able to actually stabilize the relationship. Can I just jump in one more point I'd like to make, where actually, talking
Sure.
in Congress, what they can work on together, and this relates directly to China, frankly. There is one area where the two sides have a meeting of minds also, and that is with regard to an outbound foreign investment screening mechanism. It's been in the works for quite a while. An executive order was actually due sometime in December. I'm expecting
Sir,
it
can you
sometime.
repeat what mechanism is it? Sorry, I failed to catch you. What mechanism was it?
It's a mechanism to screen outbound investment from the United States to China and create blocks in certain sectors, maybe quantum, AI, semis. They've already done in semis, etc. Block U.S. investment in China. So this is not about China trying to acquire a company in the US. It's about Americans making an investment in a Chinese company, outbound American investment in China. And I think they're trying to create a screening mechanism to raise the bar on these sort of
It's like a
investments.
CFIUS, but the other way.
Yes, exactly. It's a reverse CFIUS. CFIUS is for inbound. Reverse CFIUS would be for outbound.
Yeah.
And they're working on an executive order. And frankly, there is a head of steam both on the Republican and Democratic side with regard to actually legislating something in this regard. And so once the executive order comes out, I'm expecting in the next month or two, we might actually see over the next year and a year and a half, something like this reverse CFIUS being legislated.
Reverse
So, I mean,
CFIUS.
one needs to
Wow.
be aware of
Thank
that.
you for highlighting this potentially very important mechanism. I'm sure many of our viewers are investors, traders, economists. They're watching this very closely. Rick, I wanted to go back to the issue of U.S. economy. We saw conflicting numbers there, 517,000 jobs added, the lowest unemployment rate in decades, 3.4%. But on the other hand, according to the ABC Washington Post poll, only 16% Americans say that they feel that they're better off than they were previously. What do you make of the real state of the U.S. economy?
Both are true. The U.S. economy is doing a lot better than Americans think it is, but politically, what Americans think is what's real. This has happened in past presidential elections, particularly with the first George Bush, when the economy was recovering in 1992, but people felt terrible about the economy. Joe Biden has to show the people of the country that he's doing something. That yes, instead of just saying, oh, things are going very well, we have inflation under control, jobs are plentiful, he has to talk in a way that connects with people, that he understands the problems that people face. Some of this is partisan. Republicans almost universally feel that things are terrible, where just when Donald Trump was president, Republicans said that things were wonderful, even though the economy is roughly the same as it was before COVID. But right now, what Joe Biden has to do is to get out of the way of the economic growth, but to show Americans that he cares. He has to change their attitude more than the real economy. There's not that much the president can do. As we've talked about, the Fed actually has more power over the future of the economy than the president over this next year. But Joe Biden has to show that he cares, has to work on communicating with the American people what is going on and what he and maybe he and the Republicans can do in a positive way.
Yeah, Sura, the Fed is expected to raise rates again next month to up to 5%. It just did raising the rates some a week ago. I mean, what do you make of the impact of the Fed's rate hiking and especially the ripple effects on emerging economies, on countries such as China?
First, let me stay with the U.S. economy. The U.S. economy seems to have weathered the rate hikes slightly better than anticipated, and therefore, if there is a downturn, the expectation is that it will be a soft downturn, and that is if there is a downturn. The economy just might be a little flat for a while, but obviously, from a political standpoint, that hurts Biden because you don't want to go with a flat economy running into your 2024 campaign. I would say emerging economies have weathered the interest rate hikes very, very well, frankly. And this is both Latin America and in emerging Asia. And reason for that is they've gone through these sort of financial and macroeconomic and capital flow crises before. and they know the things that they need to do to to run a tight fiscal ship and to balance their budgets and basically have good policies, macroeconomic policies, and this has helped them. But there are a few countries, both in the developed world and in the developing world, which have taken on too much debt and now are under threat of distress in some ways. I mean, the UK economy is not doing well. Italy, there's the interest rates might suddenly see a rise in its rates if the management is not well handled. There are cases we know about the Zambias and the Sri Lankas and the Ghanas, but these are very specific countries which need specific solutions. As a group, I'd say emerging economies have done very well considering how high and quick the interest rate hikes by the Fed have been.
Yeah, one more issue about the U.S. economy before I jump to social issues. Joseph, we saw that the Republicans are reluctant to make some of the spending cuts proposed by Joe Biden. How likely is it, do you think, that the partisan divide might result in a default, something that we've seen a couple of times in the past decades?
Well, I think the earlier comment that McCarthy will ultimately have to deal on the debt ceiling is absolutely true. You know, we can talk about political defaults, but the idea that we're actually going to have a financial default is extremely remote at this point. That will only happen when the dollar ceases to be the global supranational currency, and that will come at some point, but not in the near term. I think one of the things that I suspect with McCarthy is that he understands that in the past, when Republican speakers played politics with the debt ceiling, that it didn't fare well for them. It certainly played to the rabid Republican base, but it didn't help them overall. And he's already signaled that he will try to be more reasonable and diplomatic. So I suspect that he will go ahead and support that. Now, I mention this because one of the things that we saw with Trump's populism, is unrestrained spending, which Republicans historically were opposed to. I think they're very cautious at this point in time to start cutting policies that could undermine their local popularities, especially given the very, very tight margins that we see in polarized society.
Yeah, one social issue that people kept mentioning is the gun violence in the United States. We have this report from our reporter, Nitza Soledad-Perez, filed from the United States. Let's watch it.
Another community traumatized. This time it was Newport News, Virginia. One of the latest school shootings in the U.S. was perpetrated by a 6-year-old, critically wounding his teacher, Abigail Swerner, during class. Just days into 2023, the shooting took place in a day gun injuries were reported at 2 other U.S. schools, according to a tracker compiled by the Education Week news organization. On January 23rd, 2 teenage students were killed, and an adult male was injured at an alternative educational program for at-risk youth affiliated with the Des Moines School District in Iowa. Police cited an alleged gang dispute.
School shootings are a constant threat in American society. There have been more than 150 of these violent incidents since 2018, according to Education Week magazine.
The community of Newport News is still grappling with the notion of such violence carried out by a first grader.
A 6-year-old doesn't really know reality from any fantasy. A 6-year-old can think and say, I'm angry, I want to shoot you, but to them it's bang bang like they would watch on TV. It's not that I'm really meaning and planning on killing you, but they can be very angry.
And a common theme resurfaces: warnings that school administrators allegedly ignored. The wounded teacher's lawyer accused school administrators of failing to act, despite 3 separate appeals for intervention over suspicions that the boy had a gun. The superintendent of the Newport News School District was fired in the aftermath of the shooting. The school's principal was removed from her post, while its assistant principal resigned. At this time, authorities have not indicated whether they will prosecute the parents for not properly securing the weapon. Meanwhile, Rich Neck Elementary reopened for classes after a 3-week pause, with new metal detectors in place. Nitza Soledad-Perez, CGTN, Miami.
Yeah, that was really tragic and unfortunate. Rick, what kind of measures, legislations do you foresee to address gun violence going forward?
Well, that was a terrible case and a scandal that it was allowed to happen. Unfortunately, I really don't see much happening. You're going to have calls for metal detectors at schools at all level. I mean, we had thought that elementary schools, primary schools would be exempt, but you're going to see that. Republicans are going to call for arming teachers, which is something that most teachers don't want. Teachers do not. I mean, a great majority of teachers do not want because they don't want more guns in the classrooms. But really, I think that it's part of a bigger discussion. I mean, we can say this every time there's another mass shooting, which happens twice a week, sadly, in the United States. There are calls for doing something, and nothing really happens. States are taking the lead right now, and you're seeing a real divide in the country between states with a lot of guns and states where people have fewer guns. But I really don't see very much of substance happening. But there has to be some way. There has to be some way to get guns out of the hands of people who are known to be dangerous. I mean, it's just ridiculous. We have this discussion over and over again, and nothing ever seems to happen. I mean, I just want to say one thing about the United States, which is the availability, the ready availability of firearms makes it so easy for people who get mad to go and shoot many people. This is a difference between the United States and other countries. All around the world, people get mad, but only in the United States do people get mad and shoot and shoot one person, shoot 4 people, shoot 50 people.
Yeah, calls for doing something, and then in the end, nothing happens. Joseph, do you see this happening again?
You know, I do, and I do for several reasons. One, we saw quite a number of new social problems being increased during the U.S.'s catastrophic response to COVID, surging crime, drug, alcohol, depression. We saw children losing a couple of years of schooling effectively, especially in poor communities, minority communities. And so these are all problems that are going to play forward in society. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't see more attacks from students themselves in schools. And I am very concerned about these policies of arming teachers. I think that adding more guns to classrooms simply invites more tragedy. I think we'll certainly see cases of teachers eventually shooting students, or students getting access to teachers' guns and shooting others. So, but the bigger problem, as has been already articulated, is that we have hundreds of millions of guns in U.S. communities already in the hands of private citizens, police, security forces. And every time in the last several years when national legislation has been discussed, we've seen surges in gun and ammunition sales because people are afraid that they're going to lose access despite already having enough to kill many people several times over. So we have already this massive and still growing arsenal of weapons circulating in the U.S. And it's not just that we see a different approach by the states. In fact, the federal government is substantially limited in terms of the type of policies it can pursue, given constitutional protections. And we do indeed see states moving in very different directions, from red states in particular that are promoting more guns, and rather tepid gun control policies, even in blue states, because they know that they'll be challenged in court.
Yeah, Joseph, Sourabh, and Rick, thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. Thank you all very much, and come back again. That'll do it for this edition of The Hub on CGTN. Thank you for watching. Our news coverage continues on CGTN. Bye and take care.